now that people are joining, and so welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see you, and I'm so happy about this event. We have a very distinguished group here, by the way. I know quite a few of the names that are joining, and so there's a lot of depth in the arts from a um, evolutionary perspective. Not to shame anyone here who feels more like a newbie. You are welcome also. So I'm so happy to introduce Joe Carroll, who is a true pioneer of the arts, especially literature, from a evolutionary perspective. And in addition to his talk, which he's about to give, Joe has also written the inaugural essay of a series that's now appearing on This View of Life, titled "Which Way? Evolution in the Arts." And so I think um, um, without further ado, let's have you start, Joe, and then we have 90 minutes for this session, so we have lots of time for Q&A. And then also at 6 p.m., the Pro-Social Cafe will also continue to talk on this theme. I'm looking forward to that also. And so if you're a member of the Pro-Social Commons, then you know how to join the cafe. And if you're not a member of the Pro-Social Commons, then please join us, because we're having this conversation, this type of conversation all the time. And I think the pro-social world in general and the Pro-Social Commons in particular can play a role in catalyzing the study and practice of the arts from an evolutionary perspective. I'm excited about that. So Joe, take it away.
Okay. See how long it takes for the share screen to get going. Okay, there we go. It takes, there we go. Okay. The truth about fiction, biological reality, and imaginary lives. The main purpose of the talk is to try to clarify the relationship between biological reality, our evolved human nature, and the imaginary lives that constitute fiction. Characters in fiction are imagined people, and they obviously have some kind of connection to our evolved, adapted human nature. The question is, what kind of connection? I'm going to argue that there is an interactive causal relationship, that imaginary lives don't simply reflect biological reality, but actually interpenetrate biological reality and alter it. So, in order to make that argument, I'm going to have a series of, I think, 7 propositions, some of which should be more or less self-evident or non-controversial. Probably wouldn't get a lot of argument saying that humans are values-directed, goal-oriented agents. To provide a foil for that, you could assume that people are automatons who act mechanically on the basis of impulse. And there is a whole field of literature that typically depicts people in that way, called naturalism. It emerged in the late 19th century partly as a consequence of Darwinian evolutionary thought. And there is a tendency in an early version of evolutionary psychology to treat people as adaptation executors, which would imply that they are more or less mechanical. They work on impulse. But to say that they're values directed and goal oriented is to say that they have a mind, an imagination, and their values, the things that they think in life are worthwhile, have a major influence on how they behave, the kind of aims that they give themselves. When they get up in the morning, what they think is worth doing. The second proposition is that fictional stories depict imaginary agents, usually human, who pursue goals directed by values. So just a direct correlation there between what people are and what characters are. It's going to get a bit more complicated, but at the beginning, at least, you've got a simple correlation. So Here is a perhaps more controversial statement, probably not among most of the people who are participating in this seminar, but certainly in literary study in general, human nature would be uh, a forbidden term. It would if you stood up in the middle of a Modern Language Association conference and said, I believe in the evolved and adapted character of human impulses, you would be denounced on the spot for perpetrating all the forms of oppressive power structures that it has now become the purpose of academic literary studies to contest. So here's another proposition that might be more controversial, and this perhaps more controversial among evolutionists, that imagination is part of human nature. There's one level at which that's self-evident. Everybody fantasizes or dreams. I don't think anybody would deny that. But the question is, uh, are those dreams and fancies a functional part of human nature? Are they just, on the one hand, a kind of sideshow, a trivial reflection of activity that in which they have no necessary part, or is it really part of the whole human adaptive complex? And I'm going to argue, of course, that it is part of the whole human adaptive complex. And to make that argument, I'll use this term. Humans live in virtual imaginative worlds. And what I mean by that is that people are not in unmediated contact with some raw reality that much more so than for any other species, our sensory percepts, the objective, actual physical reality around us, is filtered through imaginative constructs, our memories, our anticipations of the future, our cosmological visions, our religious or ideological concepts, our self-images, our self-narratives. We are surrounded constantly, enveloped within our own imagination, and that has a tremendous impact on how we behave. So, fictional stories shape and color virtual imaginative worlds. This, I think, should probably be fairly non-controversial. That the stories we read have an impact on how we view the world. If we're carried away by uh, uh, some charming romantic fantasy, we walk out and we kind of expect the world to offer us that sort of experience. If we read something that's cynical and pessimistic and depressing, uh, we might look at the world as in a more bleak and disillusioned way. So fictional stories are functional components of the human adaptive complex. That's the culminating argument for the whole presentation, and it's integrated with the idea that imagination is part of human nature. So we'll start. I'll just go through these one by one and illustrate them. Uh, First, I'm going to give I just Googled goals to see what kind of things came up, and uh, lots of things come up. People are constantly making lists, New Year's resolutions. I thought this one was kind of funny because it's so typically human, uh, involving all kinds of costly adventures, buying new furniture, buying jewelry, traveling, buying a car, and then right in the middle there, save money, spend less money. Uh, well, okay, yeah, we'll try to get it all done. Here's a more organized way of looking at it, and that makes kind of obvious sense uh, in a descriptive way, the various aspects of life that you want to cover: love, career, mind, hobbies, health, money, fun, community, just all the things that you want to get done in a given year. Uh, it's a list, it's just this kind of scattered array. And all the lists that I'm going to show you, I'm going to be arguing there is an alternative in human life history theory. which gives us an organized, causally integrated way to understand all these different aspects of human life. Uh, Canada, Canada Life, a magazine, uh, did a survey to ask people life goals, not just for this year or the new year, but what do you want in the long term? And people have an idea. They have a notion of what values that they have that are going to organize their lives. Uh, their plans, the plans of mice and men do often go awry, and being happy might be less frequently realized than uh, two things there close to the bottom: having children and getting married. People are more likely to do that than to achieve the general vague goal of being happy. But of course, being happy involves doing all these other things, or at least trying to do them. Here's, a, a popular, common way to try to organize human goals and values in a synoptic way. It's still used, Maslow's hierarchy, in counseling because it has a certain kind of descriptive value. And you can look at it and you can say, yeah, sure. If you're not, if you're hungry or cold or in danger in some way, these other things are going to be less urgent for you. Maslow conceives of this as a pyramid, like you have to take care of one thing before you get to another. Uh, I think the main problem with this way of looking at human goals is that it's conceived only descriptively and hierarchically, rather than being seen in the human life theory way as a whole interactive complex of uh, biological forces working out over evolutionary time. Uh, and it's still uh, around enough so that Doug Kenrick, in a popular book in 2011, Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life, attempted to adapt it to a more EP kind of perspective, uh, which has some of the same problems that Maslow's has, and also does something that a certain kind of EP is, has a tendency to do, which is to eliminate the human mind and imagination and to restrict human behavior to just a few really basic kind of animal impulses that for Kenrick at that time culminated in parenting. And I believe in parenting. I think it's important, but it's not simply the hierarchical culmination of all human endeavor. So the next thing, fictional stories depict imaginary agents who pursue goals directed by values. I just took a list of uh, characters, well-known, familiar characters in literature, whose names happen to appear in the title of the works in which they are depicted. You'll probably recognize it goes from over here on the classical side to Gilgamesh, the first or one of the first known works of fiction. So some classical tragedies, Agamemnon, Oedipus, and Antigone, to the two great epics of the ancient world, the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Some medieval works, and then Shakespeare and other Renaissance drama. And then here a whole line of English novels from well, not Don Quixote, he's not English, but everybody who follows Don Quixote there were in some way indebted to him. Bunch of novels, standard novels, coming all the way over here to Lady Chatterley, Madame Bovary, and Anna Karenina. And then a group from American, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, all the way down to Carrie, uh, Stephen King. Uh, then some opera, Figaro, Don Giovanni, children's uh, stories, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, and then pop culture. We go from Agamemnon and Oedipus to Betty Boop and Popeye and Beavis and Butthead. These are all parts of our fictional world. Uh, and then if anybody watches television, The Sopranos, The Simpsons, House, Frasier, good, it's all good, but uh, Annie Hall, Forrest Gump, Rocky Balboa, and The Big Lebowski. So those are just ways to indicate that fictional characters are like people. Many of these characters are more real to us, more vivid to our minds. We feel uh, more familiar with them, more intimate with them than we do with the people that we meet every day around us. So, fictional stories depict imaginary agents, usually human. Thought I'd best make an obvious qualification here. It's possible to have almost any creature animated. Uh, I thought it was interesting, have for long thought it was interesting that children are at the very beginning more interested in animal stories than in anything else. And I wish that were more a subject of psychological study. I would just speculate that children feel a certain affinity with animals. Their own imaginations, their own power of reasoning hasn't yet developed as much. They're creatures of impulse and character and temperament. But of course, all of these characters are actually human. They have human personalities. They speak. They engage in simple, obvious activities like Tom chasing Jerry or Wile E. Coyote chasing the Roadrunner that uh, answer children's questions about goals in the most obvious and direct and immediate way. What's a goal in life? Well, it's to eat the creature next to you or to avoid being eaten. Children understand that. Jack London was defending himself against being called a nature faker, somebody who didn't know what he was talking about when he depicted animals. So he responded saying, I've been guilty of writing two animal stories, two books about dogs, Call of the Wild and White Fang. The writing of these two stories on my part was in truth a protest against the humanizing of animals, what we just saw with all the cartoon figures. These dog heroes of mine were not directed by abstract reasoning, but by instinct, sensation, and emotion, and by simple reasoning. He wanted to put you in the mind of an animal, and he succeeded without turning the animals into artificial humans. Now, there, as I said earlier, there is a whole school of literature in the coming around, starting with Zola in the late 19th century and extending into the early 20th, naturalism that tends to depict humans at this level, giving an adult version of the cartoon animals that so fascinate children. Values and goals are rooted in human nature, and in order to say what human nature is, I'm going to take the main categories in human life history and give a little detail quickly on each one. The most interesting thing about human life history theory is the way each one of these aspects, life phases, reproductive organization, social organization, and cognitive capacities interact, are reciprocally dependent on one another in the course of evolutionary history. They form a whole systemic group. But we'll start with life phases. What's specifically and peculiarly human? We have a long lifespan relative to that of other primates. We have a uniquely extended childhood and adolescence, and we have post reproductive survival. All of that is to enable the development of the human cognitive powers that have made us so uh, capable of adapting to different environments and becoming uh, basically top predators globally. Uh, so, life phases, reproductive organization. Here are just a list of all the different aspects. I won't take the time to go into an analysis of or give a summary of how each one of these things is related to one another and to the other aspects of human life history theory. But clearly, reproductively functional sexual differences is something we share with other sexually reproducing species. Mother-infant bonding we share with mammals. Long-term child dependency on adult care is specifically human, peculiarly human. The research by Kaplan and his group have indicated that people in the hunter-gatherer cultures don't achieve a net caloric production over consumption until they're well into their late teens. So there's a long, long period in which humans are dependent on the intergenerational transfer of resources. And because we have pair bonded dual parenting, we also have bilateral kinship networks. You probably know that we share pair bonded dual parenting with only, I think, about 5% of mammals, but we do share it with birds. Whenever the offspring require such intensive feeding care from the parents, you get pair bonded dual parenting. So then we go to social organization. And again, I'll just give you a list of all the things that are most distinctive about human social organization. Later, I'm going to be talking a little about how an evolutionary critique of literature would operate. And one of the ways in which it would operate would be to take all of these complex relationships, all these different kinds of organization for human society, to see how they are systemic in themselves and how they interact with all the other features of human experience and human life history and with our imaginative constructs. So to talk about social organization would be to look not just at seeking status or reciprocity, but to look at the way humans organize every one of these complicated little bits of human social interaction into an imaginative system. So, and then we go to cognitive capacities, which is getting to the heart of the talk for me, because these are the main components of imagination. Theory of mind or perspective taking, being able to imagine other people's minds. Mental time travel, locating the present within the past and the future, being able to get out of the immediate present. And counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking has its own literary genre with alternative histories like the Guns of the South. What if the Confederacy had automatic weapons? That's just there's a whole group of works that science fiction that operate that way. But more fundamentally, counterfactual thinking is the basis for fiction. If we couldn't think other than what is immediately in front of us, there would be no fiction. There would be no hypotheses. There would be no alternative realities of any kind. So imagination is part of human nature. This is Marjorie Taylor. She gives a definition of imagination. She's a developmental psychologist, child psychologist. She's the editor of the Oxford Handbook of the Development of Imagination. And I thought it was fascinating to read all the different phases of childhood in which the different components of imagination emerge and develop into maturity. I thought it was particularly interesting that it's only around the age of 10, towards the end of childhood, before puberty begins, that humans develop a full adult narrative capacity, the capacity to construct causally consequential sequences of action in which values and beliefs animate people in ways that cause conflict with other people. So it takes a while for children to be able to put all of those components together into a fictional narrative. I mean, very early on, kids will start playing games with you be the mommy, I be the daddy, you be the doctor, I be the patient. But those are scenes. It's not a fully constructed narrative. So the definition: imagination refers to the capacity to mentally transcend time, place, and/or circumstance, to think about what might have been, plan and anticipate the future, create fictional worlds, and consider remote and close alternatives to actual experience. That's a pretty good definition. It doesn't actually get in thinking about other minds, which will come in just a minute. Humans reflect on their own mental life, imagine other minds, and imagine themselves reflected in the minds of others. I don't know if you can see the whole cartoon here. Uh, on my screen, there's a panel that uh, contains some of the pictures of people participating in the seminar, and it blocks off part of that cartoon. Can you see the whole cartoon? You can. Okay, good. Uh, when you've been married a long time, you get to know what the other person thinks. No, you don't. And the joke is clear there. What's most interesting to me is that that thought bubble, the little bubbles going up there, is a standard feature in cartoons and comic books, and we just take it for granted. It's so common, but it indicates that there is an assumption on the part of the cartoonist that everyone out there recognizes the convention, and the convention itself reflects the reality that we can, in fact, know what's in other people's minds. I just finished a book by Peter Turkin, a really good book, in Times, on the oscillations between periods of low inequality and high social concord, and high inequality and social division. And one of what, as I say, it was a really good book. But one of Peter's a mathematical demographer, and one of his recurrent phrases, we can't know what's in other people's minds. But in fact, we do constantly make guesses. Sometimes we guess wrong, sometimes we guess right, but it's just part of our human equipment to do that. So people locate present reality within memories of the past and anticipations of the future. That's Proust with his Madeleine. You know, he had a bite of cookie and tea, and it brought him back to his childhood, and from that flowed out the whole of his memoir, Remembrance of Things Past. And I'm hoping some of you will also know who this is. That's Scrooge, and the ghost of Christmas future coming to him. Of course, in the course of the evening, in A Christmas Carol, he's visited by the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, and those transform his life. People create their own personal life stories and situate those stories in the legends and myths of their social groups. Here are two that have had some impact in the world up until 150 years ago. This general human myth, this couple, would have been a paradigm, a prototype on which many people would have modeled their own lives, with that weird little serpent creature there as the element of sin. But here's the one that probably most of the people in this seminar are participating in. It's a joke, of course, because Darwin isn't actually this hairy beast, but it does indicate that Darwin's suggesting or declaring a strong continuity between our simian past and our human present. And here's a book that Emily Johnson published just a year or two ago, The Early Evolutionary Imagination, in which she explores the way many of the writers, important writers of the late 19th and early 20th century, tried to incorporate the vision of Darwinian evolution into their imagination. Their argument is that there was an almost irresistible impulse towards mythification, towards turning the inhuman, impersonal facts of evolution into some kind of animated, emotionally driven, agonistic, dramatic way of envisioning the world and locating us within it. And here's another, this you probably recognize as the Star Child from 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is one of the things science fiction does, is to create mythic images of a possible human future. So people create elaborate conceptions of the natural order, often populate that order with supernatural agents and spiritual forces, and picture their own actions and the actions of others within that order. So here are just some examples. Egyptian to the top, the Garden of Eden to the left bottom, over here Hindu in the middle at the bottom, Aztec, a Greek myth, Atlas holding up the world, an African myth, and then right here at the very top center, an effort to another kind of mythographic effort to incorporate naturalistic thinking. That's Gaia, the earth goddess, earth as a kind of self-sustaining, almost human integrated system. For humans, alone among animal species, behavior takes on a definite value and meaning only within an imaginative structure. Some emotionally charged order of symbols made vividly present to the imagination. And that's why the arts penetrate so deeply into religions and ideologies. Every religion is surrounded by paintings and music and even incense to affect the senses, rituals and ceremonies that impress the mind. Ideologies also have their statuary and their rituals and their sacred songs. In the past 2 decades, just in the past 2 decades, the imagination has become the subject of multiple research programs in empirical psychology. That's something new, especially in cognitive evolution, developmental psychology, neuroimaging, and the psychology of reading. Until the last 2 decades, imagination was mostly the subject of humanist speculation and was, I remember using it and describing it in an article in 2012 before I became aware of this more recent research and feeling that it was highly speculative, that I was going out on a limb, but that I had to because I believed in it, but I didn't have much of a scientific support for it. And now we've got all of this. Ilona Roth in 2008 put together a little book. And at that time, again, it was kind of scattered and fragmentary and speculative, and people weren't sure what to make of it. But since then, there's been this massive research program that is exemplified, for example, by this Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought, Mind Wandering, Creativity, and Dreaming in 2018. It's one of these massive handbooks that double columns, tiny print, that has, it's almost all neuroimaging, neuropsychology. These last two elements here, aspects, evolutionary perspectives on imaginative culture, and the last one are edited volumes that I was one of the editors for. So we define spontaneous thought. Whoops, I can't actually read that because of the. Can somebody read that for me, because there's a menu that covers the top of my screen.
We define spontaneous thought as a mental state or a sequence of mental states that arises relatively freely due to an absence of strong constraints on the contents of each state and on the transitions from one mental state to another.
Okay, thank you. So here's a graph to indicate, represent that idea. If you start with weak constraint and strong spontaneous imagination, you get dreaming. That's when your conscious mind is not, your executive mind is not controlling what happens in your brain. And you go up one step from that with constraint, you get mind wandering, daydreaming. It was a consolation to me to read that mind wandering is a necessary and healthy part of life, because I've always felt guilty about drifting off. I'm reading or writing or studying, and the next thing I know, my mind's just wandering around somewhere else. Go, come back and work. So the next step up is creative thinking, where you have spontaneous thought, but it's being directed to some specific purpose. You're writing a poem or making a movie or singing a song, and then you get goal-directed thought. You also have automatic constraints, which are uh, spontaneous thought that you can't control, like rumination and obsessive thought, features of depression, ADHD. Spontaneous thought emerges from the brain's default mode network. This is the key term. This is the major discovery that has turned the imagination into a subject of scientific research. Uh, this is a meta-analysis of brain regions that are more active at rest and during tasks. Two big regions, the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex. This was discovered by accident almost. Uh, uh, Neuroscientists were mainly working on what happens in the brain when people are engaged in specific tasks like arithmetical calculations. Uh, so they wanted a null point, a 0 point from which to evaluate active activity in the brain. And what they discovered was that the brain isn't inactive, that when it's not doing some task specific work, it lights up, and there's this region in the brain. It's a specific anatomically defined brain system, preferentially active when individuals are left to think to themselves undisturbed. Uh, at first, it was thought to be just sort of passive, what happens when you're dreaming or mind wandering. But more recent research has revealed that this network is the most integrative network in the brain. It's located topographically equidistant from more encapsulated sensory and motor elements of the brain. And it's the place where all the input from the senses go to be collected and organized into a total image of the world. So here are just some to give you an idea of where it's actually located in the brain. This is what it looks like. Those are connectones indicating the kind of network connections that extend from the main nodes. And again, it's because it connects to the amygdala and the hippocampus. It's emotionally active and is active in memory. Tasks that activate the network often require participants to retrieve episodic, autobiographical, or semantic information, think about or plan aspects of their personal future, imagine novel scenes, infer the mental states of other people, reason about moral dilemmas or other scenarios, comprehend narratives, self-reflect, reference information to oneself, appraise or reappraise emotional information, and so on. So it corresponds pretty closely to what Marjorie Taylor was calling the imagination. So the brain's default mode network, the BDMN, now it's mostly called the DMN, also spontaneous thought, also imagination, is the activity of the brain turned inward to mentally generated representations decoupled from the immediate external environment. It takes in information from the immediate external environment, but the imagery is not dependent simply on input from the environment. So it's an evolved capacity of the modern human brain. There are precursors to it in other primate brains. We don't know exactly what functions it has in the other primate brains, but in the human brain, it has expanded dramatically in the course of human evolution. And it has emerged, it's reached its current level of organization uh, in tandem with, contemporaneously with the emergence of modern human behavior. And there's a whole suite of behaviors that are called behaviorally modern. Here's a an article on the evolution of modern human brain shape that talks about the transformation of the brain over the past 300,000 years, the same period in which what we call modern Homo sapiens evolved. Modern humans have large and globular brains, globe shape, that distinguish them from their extinct Homo relatives. The characteristic globularity develops during a prenatal and early postnatal period of rapid brain growth, critical for neural wiring and cognitive development. Our data show that 300,000 years ago, brain size in early Homo sapiens already fell within the range of present day humans. Brain shape, however, evolved gradually within the Homo sapiens lineage, reaching present day human variation between about 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. So the brain was big enough, but it underwent changes in organization over the past 300,000 years. And there's still controversy. There's the whole McBrearty and Brooks argument, the revolution that wasn't, that there was never a human revolution. That argument is basically that the massive changes in the structure of the human brain over the past 300,000 years has no real causal relationship to the emergence of behaviorally modern humans. That strikes me on the face of it as a strained argument. So here's the way the shape of the brain has changed in shape. These are the green areas, or the areas that have been on the surface most changed. So globularization affects imagery, self-awareness, language, social cognition, and affective processing. All of those are aspects of what we call imagination. The evolutionary brain globularization in Homo sapiens parallels the emergence of behavioral modernity documented by the archaeological record. Features used to mark behavioral modernity range from work bone, ornaments, pigment, and complex multi-component lithic technologies to material indicators of manipulations of symbols and abstract thought, such as unequivocal art. That was the argument, that the brain has evolved in a way that makes the imagination a functional part. Here's talking about the particular functions the imagination has: creating the self as a values-directed, goal-oriented agent, understanding other people, both for cooperative endeavor and for competitive manipulation, integrating individual identity and social group identity, creating new linkages among ideas, and understanding multiple alternative possible courses of action. All those particular functions add up to one overarching adaptive function, creating an imaginative virtual world, an inner world that guides our behavior in the actual physical world. So, fictional stories, coming back to the main subject for this talk, the fictional stories begin early in life. Kids, from the time they're able to sit up and watch a screen, are interested in cartoons. And before the age of literacy, to say nothing of the age of digital screens, kids sat around in firelit rooms listening to old people tell them tales of Cinderella and Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. And for adults, fiction illuminates all human concerns. And I'll just give you a range that are collected from human life history, what seem to be the main focal points for dramatic representation, because they're hot spots in human experience. Survival. That's Odysseus stabbing out the eye of the Cyclops who'd been eating his men. It's a classic story of survival or failure to survive. And many of you probably know The Road, the Cormac McCarthy novel that was turned into a movie about a post-apocalyptic universe in which a father and his son are wandering through a devastated landscape, avoiding cannibals and trying to survive. The mysteries of death. That's Odysseus in the underworld, giving blood to the shades of the departed so that they can have enough life to speak to him. This is Dante's Paradiso, the dead ascending into heaven. And here's the naturalistic way of thinking about death that has been, for many of us, replacing celestial images, being dead. A novel by Jim Crace begins with a middle-aged couple having sex behind bushes on a beach and beaten to death by a madman who just happens upon them. And then the rest of the novel alternates between detailed ecological descriptions of their decomposition and the way they interact with the insects and other creatures on the beach as they decompose. Those scenes alternating with scenes of their lives leading up to their death and investing it with some meaning through the perspective of their daughter who tries to take in the meaning of their life and their death. Growing up, just three classic novels. I think Harry Potter. I'm scared. I'm reluctant to call any contemporary book a classic, but I think Harry will probably last a while for children's literature. David Copperfield, uh, built out of episodes from Dickens' own childhood. And then A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, a compelling novel of a girl's awakening. She wrote the story of her life, but they wouldn't publish it. So she turned it into fiction, just saying, the characters were unreal, and they published it and it's become a classic. Sex, romance, and marriage. Somebody saw these slides and said, oh, yeah, right, three healthy relationships. Two people who kill each other, Anna Karenina who kills herself, and a woman who goes mad under the brutalizing regime of polygamy in ancient or pre-revolutionary China. Parenting, again, I could be accused of going for the dark side. King Lear, not a happy parenting story, holding the body of his dead daughter. Father Goriot, his daughter's use and abuse him. There is a happier story with this Chinese novel, Chronicle of a Blood Merchant. A man has an illegitimate child and comes to love him best of all. Every time he needs money, he sells blood. And his son gets sick, and so he sells so much blood, he exsanguinates and has to be taken to the hospital and given a transfusion. But it's basically an affirmative story of an elective family, which is surprisingly common as a theme in literature. People who don't simply operate according to the logic of inclusive fitness, but create imaginary families and imaginary communities. Community, the stories that are designed to give you a vision of a whole society. They focus on individual characters, but the individual characters are meant to be representative. The subtitle for Middlemarch is a study of provincial life. That's Coventry, actually, the town in which George Eliot grew up. And then 1984, A Nightmare Vision, that in the late 19th century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, seemed to have faded away from relevance. We thought, well, Orwell was historically significant. He captured what life was like in Stalinist Russia, but history's over and liberal democracy's won, and we're not there anymore. But George has more staying power than that. The Nightmare Vision of 1984 is becoming more relevant, unfortunately, day by day. Encounters with aliens, the various ways of encountering aliens. You can sometimes trade peaceably with them. More often, the first encounter is not all that friendly. Wells helped kick off science fiction the late 19th century by imagining, well, what if aliens came to Earth? Well, they immediately do what we do, as we did in First World War, just start turning groups into outgroups and fighting them. Golding's The Inheritors is a wonderful novel for evolutionists. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It envisions a group of Neanderthals who encounter a group of Cro-Magnons, the Inheritors, and have never seen them before, have no idea what they are, and are gradually picked off one by one by the Cro-Magnons. Then the final chapter is from the perspective of the Cro-Magnons. But it attempts to do for Cro-Magnons what Jack London did for dogs, to try to imagine what that mental life would actually be like. And the life of the mind, this is a subject as well as the source of literature. It is a subject of literature. Since mental experience is part of who we are, Aerosmith is a study of a doctor and still a novel that inspires medical students. I remember reading it when I was 16 and getting my first image of what a high scientific imagination might be like. The Magic Mountain is Thomas Mann's novel of a young man who goes to an institute for tuberculosis patients in the mountains and has a few years in which to absorb all of Western civilization and imagine things. And then Colin Toy Bean, The Master, is a biofiction, a biographical novel about Henry James. He's also got one also about Thomas Mann. So those are just main subjects in fiction. Fictional stories are functional components of the human adaptive complex. This is the perhaps the most controversial claim in the presentation. This is human life history. This is how we imagine it. Now I'm going to try to argue how it's functional that we do imagine it. Imaginative constructs are animated by the basic motives of human nature, but every element of human nature is altered, constrained, and modulated by being incorporated within an imaginative virtual world. That seems important to me, that we don't. One of the ways in which evolutionary literary criticism has defaulted, one of the forms into which it has defaulted, is to assume that there's a human nature. It's just there, it's given. People want sex, they want status, and so literature depicts them doing those things. But I would argue that when we construct fictions, we take all the elements of human nature and organize them in ways that make them systemically interdependent and that thus changes them. Every element of human nature constrained and modulated, so that a comprehensive form of evolutionary literary study would not simply point to features of human nature that are passively reflected in fictional stories. It would instead investigate the way the elements of human nature are organized and systematically modulated within the author's imaginative virtual world. And I'll give you what I think is a useful kind of schematic for levels of analysis. We start with human nature. Human nature is the beginning. If we didn't have a nature with motives and passions and impulses, nothing would happen, where there would be no stories. But every specific culture organizes the potentials of human nature in different ways, so that there's different kinds of marriage, different kinship systems, different kinds of social, political organization, different religious constructs, and all of that affects the minds of the individual artists who are working within a culture. And then every particular work of art has its own unique particular organization, though of course it has features that are common across all works. So you've got human nature, you've got a specific culture, you've got individual artists in a particular work of art. And here's an effort to just quickly to suggest something of the kind of analytic work that would go into literary study if you take this general schematic as your guide. You start with an actual and implied author, meaning the real person, Jack London, who wrote the story, and the person he projects onto the page, the kind of persona that he adopts for the reader. And then he's depicting something. He's showing you a man who's trying to build a fire to thaw out his frozen feet and not succeeding in doing it. And then you've got the author interacting with the actual and implied readers. That is, the author presupposes a certain kind of reader. Thackeray, William Makepeace Thackeray, for instance, at a certain point turns to his reader and says, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that I'm a cynic because I believe in this psychopathic character. I share her view, but no, I don't. And the question is whether he's lying to you or not. So there is an actual interaction between the author and the reader, and that's part of the whole meaning of a literary work. It's a communicative act, so that there's not just a given meaning. There's what the author depicts and how the author tries to position the reader and how the readers actually do respond to the author. You can say, yeah, I believe everything you say. Or you can say, no, I think you're telling me a fib. And then there's the meat and potatoes of what is done in literature classes. You just talk about how stories are put together, how time is managed, how point of view is managed, whether there's how much scene or summary, whether there's dialogue, what kind of verbal style enters into the story. All of that is part of the meaning, and all of it's contained within a culture, and all of culture is contained within human nature. Fictive stories influence readers' imaginative worldviews. They help shape their self-images and their personal narratives. Dan McAdams, a personality psychologist, has developed a whole field, he and his colleagues, with about the way every individual constructs a story of his or her own life. And it's not ever, presumably, just a factual account. It has a generic structure. It can be redemptive. It can be a story of despair and failure. It can be a romantic comedy that ends in happiness. But people have personal narratives, and the stories they read, the novels, the movies they watch, the songs they hear, all of those help shape the way they envision their own lives. And so it informs the values that determine their goals. All these ways, fictional stories affect behavior. We cannot but live in the imagination. We can't get away from it. We can't not be imaginative because it's just part of our brains. There's a spontaneous thought, and you cannot simply repress spontaneous thought. It's an evolved and adapted part of our nature as a species. Fictional stories emerge naturally from the human imagination. They have a function. They help organize the elements of human nature. They give us a way to take all the potentials, all the different possible motives and emotions that we have, and put them into some kind of meaningful whole. So, conclusion, the truth about fiction is that human nature animates fiction. The motives and passions that we are part of our evolved human nature are depicted in fiction. They animate characters, and they motivate writers, and they motivate readers. But the other half of that is that fiction affects human nature. The stories that we tell, the stories that we hear, change who we are. So that's it. And I will stop sharing.
All righty. Well, in the first place, thank you so much. This is so substantive and valuable. And we have plenty of time for Q&A. So please raise your virtual hands to form a queue. And I never like to be the first. So, and there were so many great comments in the chat that I know that we have a lot to talk about. And I'm not surprised that Hal Morris is first to raise his hand. And others, please follow suit. So, Hal.
Okay, yeah. I wonder, Joseph, if you're familiar with the anti-revoltio, who's written about the dreams as a simulation of social reality. He had an older theory as dreams as a simulation, as threat simulation. Then he wrote, I think, a much more interesting story, which is dreams as a simulation of social reality. But
What
he
was
has,
the name again? I didn't quite catch it. The name again.
Put the name
yeah,
in the chat. Hal, put the name in the chat if you would.
well, I did already.
No,
Okay,
no, I
good.
mean the name of the author.
I did.
Oh,
I would put it again though, just
let me find the chat. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay.
there you are.
Okay.
Uh, dreams as simulation of social reality. I think that dreaming is a kind of simulation engine that started with lower animals learning how to localize to their particular environment, and that Revoltio's theory about social reality is evolved from that.
Well, yeah, I read a fair amount about dreams a few years ago. I don't know the book that you're referring to, but
Paper.
a paper.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I'll look that up. That sounds interesting. My
About 10 years old, so there's some derivative work now.
Okay, yeah. I have the strong impression that dreams are kind of frustrating that as a subject of research, because some of the most interesting stuff uh, has been done by people who still uh, argue that dreams are non-functional, that they don't have uh, that they're just an offshoot of the mind resting or reorganizing during sleep, and that they're insignificant. I don't think that's true. I don't.
Who said that if that's true, it's the biggest mistake evolution ever made? Somebody said.
Ah, uh, well, yeah, no, it clearly occupies so much of our lives. People have always thought, that they were significant in some way. They probe dreams for prophecies and portents. I don't obviously don't think that they do that, but I do think my own. It's just a hunch, really, on the basis of what I've read and my own experience. I don't claim any expertise in the area, but that uh, I think they are threat simulations in part because I read somewhere 75 or 80% of our dreams are emotionally negatively valenced. They're unhappy. That we don't really have a lot of fun in our dreams. Occasionally we have fantasies that are pleasurable, but a lot of it uh, suggests to us uh, ways of being that we would be well advised to avoid. I think that uh, dreams are admonitory. They give us a feel for the kinds and ways of life that uh, are unpleasant to us, and the pleasant ones do the opposite kind of thing. They give us a taste. I think that they're forms of spontaneous thought. They emerge out of our anxieties, our fears. They involve our memories. I one thing I'm pretty sure of is that most people dream about their parents all the way into old age. They have dreams about their parents. So my own ultimate view of it, or opinion, speculation, is that dreams help us to integrate our current experience with our deep memories, that they help knit us together emotionally, affectively, at a deep level, just in a way that is necessary to maintain coherence for us as personalities.
Even if, I mean, even if dreams are an epiphenomenon, they can still be the foundation for imaginative culture. So they could have, so I think that there's that quick point to be made. But let me proceed to Bruce, and then I'm third up.
Bruce, I can't hear you.
Here I am.
Good.
Okay.
Sorry, it took me a moment to unmute. Joe, good to see you again.
Hi.
Hi. Um, so the prospect of hearing you talk today brought me back to your editorial on imaginative culture and human nature that you published a few years ago. And here, of course, you're looking at all of the relationships and the levels of the imagination in the default network. This is a question that has specifically to do with the kind of creativity that happens in theatrical and filmic productions. I can understand as a professor of literature, you're giving pride of place to literature and to stories that find their way into book form, especially. But it strikes me that there's a fair amount of other network interaction going on in the brain beyond the DMN network. And you do say a few things about the ways in which the attention network and the control network
Right.
also play important roles. So I'm thinking specifically about the work of actors and directors, for example, in both theatrical and filmic making. It seems to me that it's important to emphasize that all of these networks are at play in theater and film with actors and directors, because they're continually trying to anticipate the response of the audience. They must control what they're doing because they only have the economic situation is such that they only have so long to rehearse and get the show on and all of that stuff, or take the next shot, whatever it is. So I guess I'm standing up for the work of actors, directors, and the many other people that are involved in community or communal artistic production. And this would go along, of course, with many religious rituals too, which are hardly, a single artist at the core of those things. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the ways in which other networks in the brain participate in artistic, what we could broadly call artistic creation.
Well, clearly the attention network is crucial, just what you're going to pay attention to.
Sure.
If you're, as you say, a literary person sitting alone at a table writing a story, your attention is all inward. But
Yeah.
if you're a director or engaged in a ritual, you have to be aware of everybody around you and the whole scene. So the executive network has to be at work, and remember that schematic that showed levels of constraint. And if you go up to creative activity, you clearly got an executive network that's goal-oriented, that's taking whatever spontaneous impulse emerges and directing it to produce something. There is no art without a medium. So you even if it's writing a story, you've got language, and you've got either to speak it or to write it down. You've got, if it's live art like theatrical work, you've got hearing and sight, touch. You've got the spatial sense. You've got an awareness of with blocking. I did only a little theater in college, but I was impressed by how every square inch of space is kind of envisioned. It has to be part of the whole arrangement. If you're doing film, you've got large scale mechanical operations taking place. So yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't reduce artistic activity to the default mode network. I think it is crucial to imagination, to the creation of internal mental images.
And certainly central to playwriting, without a doubt. Yeah.
I think that in an ancestral context, when we think of all of the arts, everything we associate with the arts, that they're all so community based, and they usually all go together. Stephen Brown makes this point. So music and dance and story and visual art, visual enhancements all go together and are essentially all about community. You can call it the social physiology of a group is based on the activities associated with the arts is the way I would put it. But I would and maybe I could get a quick round of feedback on that before I make my next point.
Well, art is always a social activity. Yeah. An artist writes or paints or makes music with the thought of a human mind receiving it. And not just a single human mind. We all are aware of our position constantly in some kind of community or multiple communities, anxious to maintain our own position, to uphold our part in it, to do our duty, or to get along or get ahead in some way. And I don't think it's possible for an artist to work without being subject to the solicitations and constraints, pressures that emerge from being part of a community. I've been, for my sins, having missed most of popular music over the past half century. I sort of tuned out sometime in the early 70s. I've been going back through the most streamed songs on Spotify decade by decade. And it's just god awful, I'll have to tell you. I'm not sorry I missed it the first time, but I'm struck constantly by the way in which the singers are, I'll say it, pandering to an audience. I mean, they're popular. It's just the popular, and that's almost by definition, it's in the nature of popular that you're appealing to, I won't say the basest instincts, but the most facile and easily satisfied impulses of your audience. But even a classical musician, a classical is thinking about how his audience is going to. Nobody likes to be booed off stage, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So, so
Thanks, Joe.
I want to do some broad sort of field building discussion with you. I think the way to summarize much of what you said is that our meaning systems, our symbolic meaning systems, are the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so if we take dual inheritance theory seriously, two streams of inheritance, then everything you've been saying about imagination, I think, could be thought of as a cultural inheritance system that ultimately results in behavior. So with some other authors, I coined the term symbotype as just a newfangled word for our symbolic systems, but to stress the comparison with genotype. But my question to you, or what I'd like you to comment on, because that derives from the Richardson-Boyd tradition of cultural evolution. And historically, we don't have to go back too far, 1990s, then that was separate from the evolutionary psychology tradition associated with Cosmides and Tooby. And a lot of what you critiqued, I think, in your talk about how, stories are just more than, what takes place, survival and reproduction that takes place in story form. It's much more imaginative and generative than that. Really required the integration of evolutionary psychology and cultural evolutionary theory, which is, in many ways still a work in process. And
Oh,
it was
yeah.
decades in the making and still a work in progress. So if you could comment on maybe three things. One, the narrow school evolutionary psychology. Two, cultural evolution of the Richardson-Boyd tradition. And then three, the humanities, which is still not on board.
Right.
So
Right.
to a large extent. So if
Yeah.
you could just
No.
make
Yeah. No.
I
Yeah. I have
invite you
a.
to comment on that very broad topic.
Yeah. Yeah. I started criticizing evolutionary psychology almost from the beginning. I remember being at Santa Barbara in '95 at the HPES and saying to Don Brown that, well, the Tooby Cosmides program is a useful heuristic. And he was a little shocked, and I think it's more than a heuristic. But what I meant was that uh, it it prematurely limits the range of human flexibility, eliminated general intelligence. Dave Geary was instrumental in bringing general intelligence back into the range of what we think of as human nature. So general intelligence had to be reintegrated. I thought of, I gave a PowerPoint presentation once in which I created an image of uh, man or humanity as conceived by early EP, and I just made it into a robot, just a large robot with various EP components working to. I said, no, people aren't like that. So there was that level, and then the most important counter to that was the idea of gene culture coevolution, which Wilson and Lumsden pioneered, I think, in the late '70s. But it was frustrating. It took, as you said, it took so long to get off the ground. There was Richardson and Boyd. I've had my reservations about dual inheritance theory. I think that there are two streams. I think there's culture and there's human nature. There is a relatively constant background of evolved dispositions, and they have a wide range of flexibility in them, but still you've got basic human motives and impulses built into human life theory. And then, as you suggest from dual inheritance theory, you've got a line of cultural tradition, which is never, this is my reservation about the Richardson-Boyle dual model, is it's never completely segregated. It always is constrained, bound to some kind of evolved disposition, so that culture is not an autonomous and independent source. It's a source that is in a feedback loop with evolved dispositions. But
I
yes,
would,
cultures
yeah,
obviously.
I would think they would agree with that. And so, actually, let me pass to, we're mindful of the time. Let me pass to Leano, and then, some of us, I mean, all of us are welcome to get back together at 6 p.m. to continue this conversation. Joe, I didn't know if you could make it, but we others of us can show up to continue this conversation. But Liano, please continue.
Thank you. Actually, this my question is kind of gets at some of the same things because we what you just mentioned about how you know, we have biological, we have a biological nature. That's certainly true. Um, and then when you start talking about human nature, I'm not clear where you're making, if you're making any distinction there. Are we talking about biological human nature? Are we talking about biological human nature plus some kind of cognitive universals that make a broader human nature? Are we talking about cultural universals, like where I would understand um, biological and cognitive as relatively set, and then cultural as something that makes different representations of the world that are relevant to those particular biological and cognitive concerns.
Right.
Or are we talking about, you know, even you know, sociological universals, where I would differentiate a culture as a collection of stories, and society as a culture with a particular set of stories that are enforced. Um,
Well,
so I'm wondering where the universal part of human nature, where that extends to in
okay,
your view.
right. Uh, First, it's all biological. Nothing happens in human experience that, as I see it, isn't an activity of the brain, which is biological. Uh, there is uh, a shared human nature, which is universal, but it has components that are flexible and flexible in arrangement, and different cultures arrange those elements in different ways. Uh, every individual culture, let me take it all the way to the limit. Uh, Say we've got an individual human being, and that person shares in the common, he's got two arms, two legs, a brain, the basic cognitive equipment. Uh, and that person is a member of a culture, and that culture is itself a collective organization of the potentials of human nature. Some things are repressed, some things are emphasized. There are all kinds of ways that you can take those components and combine them. So you've got the culture, and the person lives in that culture, and the person feeds off the culture, shares things with the culture, but might also resist the culture, counteract it, have individual impulses that are contrary to the norms and values of the culture, or thoughts that are completely new and original and not acceptable within that culture. And so you've got the person in the culture and the individual who has the experiences, and you've never gotten outside of biology, though you have gotten away from some human universals. You've gotten away from uh, uh, certain things in a culture are not shared by all cultures. Not all cultures have legal systems of monogamy or polygamy, for example. Uh, some cultures do. So that would be not universal, but it would be part of it, the universal of pair bonded dual parenting, which is universal across cultures, but not universal in individuals. Not every individual represents uh, all of the commonalities that are shared by all cultures. There are individuals who uh, deviate individually from any given cultural norm. So, but it's all biology.
So let me push back on that a little bit because I think that I would argue that there is a level of biology that creates a level of cognitive experience or cognitive capability, and then above that above that we have through language the ability to create these imagined worlds. Um, and those imagined worlds are not themselves tied to biology except in the ways that biology that biology needs to survive. So that part of it is kept consistent, but there's another level of organization that happens that is non-biological.
Yeah, if I need to bring this to a close, and so first the link to the 6 p.m. cafe is in the chat, and I think that more or less in agreement with you, Liana. I think that as soon as we recognize an open-ended nature to human imagination and culture as an evolutionary process in its own right, it's at that point that we can say something to the effect of there is no human nature other than what evolution produces. And of course, that's too far. So we of course there is a mechanism to all of this, but to an impressive degree, we can understand the great bushy tree of cultural diversity as like the great bushy tree of biological diversity. We don't talk about an animal nature writ large. There's many, many thousands of species out there. And so we really shouldn't talk about human nature writ large when there's many, many thousands of cultures out there, each adapted to their respective environments with new forms in the future that could be different than anything which has existed in the past. And so I think that need for something open-ended is what people from the humanities cling to when they talk about such things as social constructivism, as they should. And so there is, I think, a reconciliation here. And a topic we didn't get to is why is it that on this topic is among the slowest to evolutionize? I mean, you look at psychology, anthropology, economics, even religion are all further down the path of being interpreted from an evolutionary perspective than the arts. And I really want to know why is that both the academic study of the arts and when it comes to practicing the arts, then there's a whole dimension there that we want to talk about. So I think I'm trying to kind of lay a table, create a menu for us to be talking now moving forwards into what we can do to catalyze this, both the study of the arts from an evolutionary perspective and the practice of the arts from an evolutionary perspective is something that we can catalyze so that it takes place faster than it would otherwise, is what I'm so excited about and grateful to Joe for your contributions, your career-long contributions, and your contribution today. So I want to end by thanking you, and then hoping that we can all continue together through this, through things that we co-create using our imaginations.
Thanks, David.
All righty. So we'll see some of you at 6.
Bye-bye.